Now, in this last section, we're going to talk about the Vikings and the impact they have on Western Europe during the early Middle Ages. Now, the Vikings were raiders from Scandinavia, and they mainly came from Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, this region here in Northern Europe. However, you would occasionally find Vikings coming from other European countries as well. While today we use the term Viking as a noun to revert to a group, the Scandinavian raiders, it was actually a term, a verb. Viking was, originally a verb. The idea was that there was people from Scandinavia that would go a Viking, which meant that they would go off on voyages to explore and raid other territories. And there were many other reasons why we see Vikings moving outward from Scandinavia when we get to the 9th century. Probably the primary motivation for the Viking raids was a desire for wealth. By attacking other areas and plundering them, this would bring more wealth back to Scandinavia. And for the people who participated in these Viking raids, it would really bring them a great personal wealth. There also appears to be a desire for women as well. When people have done some genealogical studies of the Viking groups, that end up in areas like Iceland, they've noticed that in addition to Scandinavian genetic coding, they also find a high percentage of genetic coding from Britain, which suggests that these Vikings were going to Britain, stealing women and taking them to Iceland to create new societies and have children with these women. So women were a motivation for going on raids. Vikings were also interested in getting slaves. They would be able to take slaves from the areas they were raiding and sell them throughout Europe. It also appears that social status was sometimes a motivation for Vikings. They could gain a great reputation as a warrior and as an explorer, and they could go on these raids and return victorious with lots of plunder. Now, later on, their motivations will kind of shift from the kind of wealth and women and slaves and social status to a more obtaining land. So eventually, as we move kind of later portion of the 9th century, we kind of see this desire for land, and Vikings start settling in some of the areas that they formerly had just been raiding in. And then lastly, I think there's a reason why we see the Vikings going on their voyages to explore and raid. That is, I think that many people who participated were looking for an adventure. They wanted to, see what lay beyond their hometown. And so I think you could say that the adventure is another major motivation for these Viking explorations and attacks. Now, our image of the Vikings oftentimes comes from the cartoon images that we see as children, but many of those cartoon versions of Vikings have a lot of inaccuracies when it comes to how Vikings probably looked. One of the biggest inaccuracies is that Vikings had horns on their helmets, and they really don't. The Vikings would wear either leather or metal helmets into battle that did not include horns, because if you're wearing a horned helmet, it's a way too easy for someone to knock it off your head or grab it. That's just not good if you're fighting. So the horns on the helmets really come from the 1800s when you start seeing people in opera use them. And it becomes a popular image, but it's not really one based on fact. Another thing that we usually see when Vikings are portrayed is that they're kind of seen as like a lot of facial hair and long, scraggly hair, and a lot of archaeology that we've uncovered that the Vikings really seem interested in grooming themselves. Most Vikings would bathe at least once a week, which was a lot more frequent than other parts of Europe at the time. They were also probably a little bit cleaner than most of the other Europeans. They would braid their beards, braid their hair. They seemed to have worn some makeup, especially before going into battle. And the Vikings were kind of, they would paint their faces and go to appear more fierce, but even normally they seemed to use some eye makeup. Both men and women would fight. The elite would fight with swords, but most common Vikings could not afford the cost of a sword. They would fight with one-handed kind of a short axe instead. They would have a very small knife known as a sax, and they would use that for stabbing in battle. But it could also be just a regular knife that you could use to like cut rope, or if you're sailing or cut your dinner, I guess if you wanted to. So you can see here, kind of gives you a contrast between the way Vikings are seen in this cartoon portrayal and more of a historical portrayal. Though I would say one problem that I do have with this slide is the guy here in the historian's portrayal to me looks kind of skinny and wimpy. And I do think that, if you're swinging an axe, and you're going to build up some muscle there. So I do think that they're probably, a bit bulkier, and we'll kind of leave it at that. But they developed a couple new technologies that would give them great success when they would go on their voyages. The first technology was the longship. We have a picture of a longship here, but if you take a look at it and you notice anything interesting about the bottom, perhaps you notice that it's a rather shallow bottom. And this would be significant for long ships, because these long ships had shallow bottoms. It meant they could go up river systems where the water wasn't quite as deep as it was in the ocean. So with the development of long ships, this meant that Vikings were able to penetrate into the interior parts of Europe because they could sail up the river systems and get to that area. If you're a raider or attacker, it would be really difficult for you if you had a big giant ship with really large keel. And so this made Vikings even more of a threat to the people of Europe because, there wasn't a lot of, it was not easy to hide from them. They could just sail up the river system to attack various settlements. Not only could these long ships sail up rivers, but they were also able to sail across oceans as well. And you notice on this Viking longship, they have a mast here. So if it was actually under sail, they would have big sails that would be attached to the mast, and the sails would allow them to move quickly using wind power. And these ships were able to cross from Scandinavia to areas of Britain and Scotland and Ireland. They were able to get from Iceland and Greenland, and not only that, but there also appears to be evidence that the Vikings managed to sail to North America off the coast of Nova Scotia, which is like up in Canada. The prevalent theory is that they were going there to fish and fishing off the coast of Nova Scotia. They weren't using it as like a permanent settlement, but more of a base of operations. And they were engaged in fishing ventures, and they had enough fish, they had caught enough, they would load their ships up and sail back across the ocean. But it's kind of interesting to think that, several hundred years before Columbus makes his voyage across the Atlantic, the Vikings had already, in a way, discovered North America. It's because of the new technology of these long ships that they had another technology that helped them with sailing, and that was the sunstone. And the sunstone would allow them to determine the placement of the sun in the sky, even if it was cloudy. And basically, the Vikings navigated by the sun. So having a sunstone would be very important to help you kind of figure out where you are and plot your course based on the sun. So with these new technologies, the Vikings would, be a considerable threat to the people of Europe. When they decided to go on raids, they followed very basic general strategy more often than not. And that strategy was to attack churches and other targets, we call them soft targets, to kind of borrow modern technology or terminology, and areas that were not very well defended. So churches were primary targets because they learned very quickly that because the Vikings are not Christian, they're pagans. But the Vikings learned that the Christian churches would have riches because people are donating money, and they see the churches as an area with a lot of wealth that they can get. And of course, priests and monks, for the most part, are not trained in military arts, so they don't pose much of a military threat to the Vikings. So churches are their favorite targets. But there's one particular monastery in northern part of Britain, a place called Lindisfarne, and it got attacked like 3 times. And they would basically destroy the monastery, steal the stuff, and the monks would come back, rebuild it, and then years later, the Vikings would come back, attack it again. And they knew that they were looking for these soft targets. They would kind of also look for villages that could be easily raided, and these raids, the primary purpose was to gather slaves and plunder, and looking for whatever riches they could get their hands on. They were also looking for, again, slaves. That they tend to focus on women, though. And it's not to say they didn't take male slaves, they did, but again, this kind of goes back to the general strategy. Look for targets that are easy to control, easy to attack. So women tended to be weaker than men, and women were, they felt were more easily controlled, and they could get women as slaves. And they would, of course, also take monks as well as for slaves, and monks don't really know how to fight back very well, so you see a lot of monks that are going to become slaves, even, the purpose was not necessarily to grab men. But they're going to get rich, and they're going to be surrounded by individuals who can't really fight back. Now, primarily, these attacks were what raiders were doing, but we start to see them change their strategy when they get to England, starting around the year 865. And it's that year when the Great Heathen Army arrives in England. And this is going to be the name that the Anglo-Saxon chroniclers give the Vikings. And we do have to keep in mind that when we study the Vikings, that they're not leaving behind records. It's really their opponents that are writing about them. So everything that these opponents say is obviously going to be very biased. So we kind of have to filter the primary source information that we have on the Vikings, keeping in mind that it's presenting a very biased picture from the perspective of their enemies. But the Great Heathen Army is a large coalition of Vikings who do arrive in England. Historians don't know how much of the Vikings are coming at this time. Probably a good estimate is between 1,000 and 3,000 Vikings, which is a very large raiding party. And they come to the area to capture slaves and plunder. And the Great Heathen Army was probably led by some individuals who claimed to be descendants from the legendary figure known as Ragnar Lothbrok. Again, because it's really difficult to know the story, but if you know Ragnar Lothbrok, we do know he actually existed. There's a debate whether or not these stories about Ragnar Lothbrok, are true or not, but he's a figure that allegedly had come to England earlier, had encountered the Northumbrian king, and that king had killed him by throwing him into a pit of snakes. So the stories claim that that his sons, who were united together, lead the Great Heathen Army and basically get their revenge for their father's death. We certainly know that there was an individual named Ivar the Boneless who was part of this campaign. And if you ever watched the show Vikings, that's kind of centers around that too. He had a brother, Oba, and you see Oba, possibly Bjorn Ironside was part of this visit. They lead these Viking commanders, and they come to England. They go through East Anglia, they move towards York, and they start turning towards southward towards the kingdom of Mercia. And at this point in history, England is not united. Instead, it's divided into these smaller kingdoms of the Saxons. And in a way, that makes the Vikings' attack a little easier because they're not facing a unified country. And so there's not a lot of coordination there that happens initially to stop the attacks. But what we see during this invasion of the great heathen army is that the strategy shifts. And this is a key point. Their strategy goes from simply gathering plunder and slaves. We see that they are now interested in land and settlement. So the difference between the earlier Viking raids and this raid is that now they want to settle there. And they're not just getting plunder and leaving. So they're hanging around in England, and this represents major shift in strategy. Now, the King of Wessex, who controls large portions of territory in East Anglia and parts of Northumbria, there's this kingdom that they have a difficulty conquering called the Kingdom of Wessex. And Wessex is down here in the southern part of England, and it plays a major role in preventing the Vikings from taking over England. And the king that really stands up to them is named Alfred, and he becomes Alfred the Great because he goes on to stop the Viking advance southward, and he prevents the Vikings from taking the southern portion of England and really turning all of England into a Viking stronghold. He defeats one of the Viking leaders, and he has some success, but what you tend to see with these Viking armies is that they join for a while, they get plundered, they go and they suffer defeat, and they can't get paid, and then they kind of disintegrate. They go off looking for another leader that promises victory and riches. And these Viking armies tended to come together for a while, then dissolve. So Alfred the Great is able to defeat them, one of the larger armies led by a Viking leader named Guthrum at the Battle of Edington in 878. And this is a major victory. He's able to sit down with the Vikings, carve out a peace agreement, and part of that is that he signs it with Guthrum, and Guthrum has to convert to Christianity, and he has to agree not to send his armies into Wessex, and in return, they could remain in the territories that they had already managed to conquer. And that's where the Vikings settled, this region here in pink on the map, which was known as Danelaw, or the area in which the Danes held sway. And it's sort of a minor theme that occasionally, periodically, the English are not very inventive when it comes to names. So Danelaw region is where the Vikings are establishing now. But by doing this, King Alfred manages to prevent all of England from falling into Viking hands. So by asking Guthrum to convert to Christianity, which he actually does, we start to see the process of Vikings becoming Christianized. And over time, Alfred would encourage more and more Vikings to adopt Christianity. And he would also, after he's kind of solidified his rule even more, would continue to engage in various battles and skirmishes with the Vikings to try and limit their political authority and unify the kingdoms together. Alfred would not be the one who accomplishes this goal of creating a unified England, but his grandson, Athelstan, would manage to pull the four major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms together and really start ruling as the first English king. And there's a history program on Netflix called The Last Kingdom. It's kind of a fictional account about this, and it's really interesting to kind of see. But it gives you a sense of the time period and the chaos that's happening. And we're seeing instability because of the rights to control land. Now, as we said, the Vikings don't leave written records. They have a pretty big legacy, though. For one thing, the Vikings are everywhere, or so it appears. We already mentioned that they're in North America, they're in Britain, they go to France, they actually attack Paris at one point. The city doesn't fall into their hands, but they do inflict significant damage in England, or in Greenland and Iceland. They go to parts of Russia, they travel to the Byzantine Empire. They actually get to Constantinople, and the Byzantine takes an interest in the visitors from Scandinavia. He hires some of them as his bodyguards, and they're known as the Varangian Guard. And so the Vikings will actually serve the Byzantine Empire for a while. We also said that, the Vikings' initial strategy of quick raids and plundering and slaves does start to transform when they get land and settle in places like England and northern France. In northern France, the Vikings that settle there are called the Normans, and the settlers, the Vikings who settle over time, will slowly convert to Christianity. They're still going to be well trained in military arts, but they're not going to be raiding as much. And they're a lot more peaceful, and it leads to that they kind of domesticate these Vikings, and they're not like house cats, but They still have military fierceness, but where Alfred the Great is called the Great because he prevents them from taking over England, all he really did was delay the Viking taking over England, because in 1066, a man named William the Conqueror from Normandy, and he's the Duke of Normandy, he actually comes from Normandy. He defeats the Saxon king named Harold at the Battle of Hastings, and Harold's defeated, and this allows William to become the King of England. William is a Norman. In other words, he's a Viking. He's one of those domesticated Vikings, and William the Conqueror manages to conquer England. So if you're a fan of English history, everything comes full circle, and the Vikings do eventually conquer all of England. But we see that the Vikings would leave behind this legacy of settlement around the world, and also their military prowess would be, continuing to be a legend and be legendary for years to come.